All right, good morning, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for joining us. We want to welcome Matthew Shepard, who is the Director of Communications and Outreach for the Xerces Society. This is one of my personal favorite presentations because it goes over really just a lot of great basic information, but ways to help pollinators. And with Pollinator Week coming up next week, it's the great way to get us all prepared. So thank you, Matthew, for joining us, and welcome.
Cool. Well, thank you so much, Rachel. And I appreciate your kind words. And I'm pretty sure those weren't just because I am your boss. So hopefully I'll be able to live up to what you just described me. Well, good morning, everybody. Good afternoon for those of you in further time zones. As you just heard, I'm currently heading up the communications team here and the outreach team at Xerces Society, but I've actually been involved with pollinator conservation for 20 years. I got into this back in 1999 when I first joined the Xerces Society and started doing pollinator conservation, initially just on a few small sites, but that gradually expanded out of Oregon and Washington, and we became nationwide in the end. I'm going to talk for about 45 minutes. I'm going to be covering the basic stuff about why pollinators are important, the diversity of pollinators. The main focus of what I'm talking about today will be on our native bees. And so I will also talk for a little while about their natural history so that you understand what they need. And then I'll move into talking in general terms about some strategies that you can use in your garden or a park or business landscaping, wherever you may have space to try and put pollinator habitat in and do something to help bring back the pollinators. One thing I'm not going to do with such a short period of time and so many people, because I understand more than 600 people have signed up for this webinar, which is pretty amazing. And this demonstrates the level of enthusiasm and commitment and dedication that there is out there to help bees and other pollinators now, which is really, really fantastic. And I thank you all for being here. But what I can't do is I can't delve into specific plants that you might put in your garden in Ohio or North Carolina or Oklahoma or California, just because every place you go, every garden, every region is going to be different. Soils are different, rainfall is different, the temperatures are different, the plants are different. That's just beyond the scope of what I can try and cover with such a broad audience. But there are lots of places where you can find that information. Xerces Society, for example, has regional plant lists, which will quickly point you in the right direction. So just very briefly, the Xerces Society, we are an environmental nonprofit. We were started in 1971. Our mission is to protect invertebrates and their habitat, and that boils down to the essence of protecting the life that sustains us. We do hands-on conservation. We partner with farmers and land managers and park managers and hundreds and thousands of people all across the country and in several other countries to put habitat in on the ground, because in the end it's the habitat that's most important. We do advocacy, although we like to keep everything positive and do things through collaboration. There are times when you need to stand up and defend and protect rare species, for example, or push back against things like pesticide use. We also are involved directly in research. We are an evidence-based, a science-based organization, and although we have partnerships with many scientists in universities around the world, we also undertake our own research so that we know that the information we provide, and when we go out and provide advice to people or draw up a plan on how to create habitat, we know that it's going to work because it's based on evidence. And then we also do education, which can be as varied as webinars. When we can get out again, we'll be tabling more places and doing in-person workshops. We have a website and we produce a lot of publications. I do want to give a shout out to our partners, our members, our donors in 15 plus countries, the foundations, the businesses that help provide funding for us, the scientists that keep us honest and make sure that our science and what we're saying is correct, plus the the hundreds of thousands of individuals and farmers and land managers who are actually doing work and making a difference in their lives and in the lives of insects and other invertebrates. I probably don't have to go into the details. In fact, I'm certainly not going to go into the details of why we should care about pollinators. But as I said, I just want to make sure that we cover the basics so that you all have a foundation in what we're talking about. And I'm not just making assumptions about what you may or may not know. Pollinators are at the heart of a healthy environment. Something in excess of 85% of flowering plants require a pollinator to move the pollen. Sometimes that's within the flower, sometimes that's from one flower to another within a single plant, and sometimes that's moving it between plants. But without the pollen being moved, the plants will not be fertilized and the plants will not be able to create seed and for them reproduce, have another generation. For us at a very selfish level, pollination, the plant reproduction, results in approximately 1 in every 3 mouthfuls of food and drink that we consume. And some of that is really obvious, the berries, the apples, zucchini, pumpkins, all sorts of food that we rely on as a result of pollination. But sometimes it's a less direct link. So cows, for example, fed on alfalfa hay, the alfalfa is pollinated. So, you know, milk, cheese, products like that are also have a connection back to pollination. And at a purely financial dollar rate, anything up to $27 billion value of crops per year in the United States comes as a result of the work of pollinators. But what we directly get from pollinators, in a way, pales into insignificant in the importance that they have for other elements of our environment and for other wildlife. The fruits and seeds that are result from the pollination make up the diet of songbirds and game birds, mammals. And then the pollinators themselves are eaten. Something in the region of 95% of songbirds feed their nestlings on insects. And a lot of that is caterpillars from moths and butterflies. And so the work that we're doing to support pollinators is supporting so much else. They also define our seasons. They touch our lives in ways we may not recognize. Springtime flowers, the berries that we go out and pick in the summer, the jack-o'-lanterns that we carve at Halloween and the pie we eat at Thanksgiving. Those are just some of the things that are kind of entrenched in our culture and for which we rely on pollinators. When it comes to the diversity of pollinators, there are tens of thousands of species of animals that provide this service of pollination. The major groups of pollinators are insects. There are some mammals that pollinate in the world, and there are some birds that pollinate in the world. And here in the United States, for example, there are hummingbirds that are pollinators. There's also a species of dove that helps pollinate the saguaro cacti in the desert Southwest, and a couple of species of bats that also pollinate those cacti. But the bulk of our pollinators are insects, and those insects come from just a handful of major groups. Going across the top of the screen there, from the left, you've got butterflies and moths, 2 groups that together go to make up the Lepidoptera as a insect order. On the top right, you have flies. Not all flies are pollinators, but a lot of flies are significant pollinators. On the bottom row, on the left, is a beetle. Again, many beetles are not pollinators, but there are some that are, and those can be really important pollinators. And then finishing off that bottom row, we have wasps and bees that together are the same group of insects called Hymenoptera. Although wasps are predators, they do go to flowers to drink nectar for energy, and so they help pollinate. But the bees, the bumblebees, mason bees, leafcutter bees, carpenter bees, all the other bees, those are the most important group of pollinators that we have in North America. The reason for this is that bees have three distinct behaviors that make them so important. The first is that they actively collect and transport pollen. The other insects that go to flowers, they go to the flowers sometimes just to drink nectar for energy, to fuel their flight. Sometimes they're going in looking for a mate. Sometimes they go in, many of the beetles, they actually eat parts of the flower, so they're directly feeding on the flower. But in that process, they pick up pollen and spread it around. Bees are actively collecting pollen on their body and transporting it, and to take it back to their nest where they use it to feed their offspring. And so this means that they are carrying and rummaging around and picking up a lot of pollen. They also, as I say, they have a nest, so they forage in the area around that nest. And so they forage in that area really efficiently and effectively, because they start at the nest, and then they fly out and they come back, and then they go out to a different area and they forage and collect pollen and go back, and they go out again and come back. And so they're working a relatively small area directly around the nest. And then this third thing, something called flower constancy. Bees are intelligent insects, and once they've worked out how to manipulate a flower to gather the nectar, to collect the pollen very quickly, they will go back to another bloom, another flower of that same species. And that means that the pollen is moved from flower to flower to flower within the same species, because flowers need the right type of pollen. If they get the wrong type of pollen, then they're not going to be fertilized. But bees do that very efficiently. And of course, we have to remember through all of this that bees are not getting up each morning and going like, oh, wow, I've just got to go out and pollinate. They're going out to collect food, to feed themselves, and most particularly to take back to their nest to feed their offspring. So even though they are so efficient, they are pollen collecting, pollen transporting, and pollination is still almost a chance behavior. But thanks to the co-evolution, the adaptation of bees and flowers, it has become an incredibly efficient and effective way for the flowers to become pollinated, and essential to our environment. When we think of a bee, I realize that for most people, if you say think of a bee, the first thing many people think of are honeybees. You think of the hive, the honeycomb, the queen, the workers, the caste system. But if you ask people to draw a bee, most people draw something that's black and yellow striped and kind of fat and hairy. And that's much more like a bumblebee. So it's really intriguing how the cultural associations we have with bees and the images we have bees are tied up with a relatively small group of these fascinating insects. And one reason I like this particular cartoon is because it sums up both of those ideas. You've got the honeycomb of the honeybee, but the bees themselves look a little bit more like a bumblebee. But of course, one on the right, the stripes are actually the wrong way around. As I said, for a lot of people, they think of honeybees. And although this is the bee that dominates many people's imaginations and how they picture them, and it's one that dominates a lot of media interest, honeybees are really not a typical bee. In fact, this is probably not a typical person, to be perfectly honest. the fact that you can get honeybees to swarm all over your face and form a beard is something unique to honeybees because they are such a social bee. They have such a large hive. They have the caste structure so that the workers will follow the queen. Honeybees are hugely important for agriculture, for sure. We get honey from them, we get beeswax, we get all sorts of other products from them. But the honeybee in North America, it's not a native bee. It was introduced to the United States probably in the 1620s with some of the early settlers coming into Pennsylvania. Seems to be the first place where there's a record of honeybees arriving. Because back then, almost every household would have a couple of small hives of honeybees because of the honey, because of the beeswax. And it was much more recent, around the beginning of the 20th century, that honeybees began to be used more particularly for pollination. And we know that honeybees are struggling. We know that the beekeeping industry is beset by diseases and pests. Honeybees are directly impacted by insecticide use. There are nutrition and economic issues such as low honey prices have impacted the number of hives. But a year and a half ago, there was still 2.7 million hives of honeybees in the US, and that's probably an undercount because these statistics don't take into account small beekeepers with fewer than 5 hives. So that the honeybee has lots of problems and deserves a lot of support, but it's really not facing terrible problems and it's not facing extinction. Moving away from honeybees, the Xerces Society's focus in our pollinator conservation is on our native bees. And there are incredible numbers of native bees. There are roughly 3,600 species of native bees in the United States and Canada. And these include bumblebees and carpenter bees and small carpenter bees and mason bees and leafcutter bees and sweat bees and digger bees and resin bees. And the list goes on and on and on. It's an incredibly diverse group. If you want to narrow it down a little closer, and I'm using my home state of Oregon as an example here, but you could find something similar for most states across the country. Here in Oregon, we have something in the region of 600 to maybe 800 species of native bees. In the Portland area, it's probably around 100 species. And in a single garden, it would not be unusual to have 20 or 30 species of bees in the garden. This 30 species number is based on my own garden, and my garden is not large. I live in the suburbs. It's a 50-foot by 100-foot plot with a house in the middle of it. So the actual area of flowers is much smaller. And yet we still have a surprisingly high diversity of bees. And I know some gardens around that have probably twice as many species. So that it's incredible diversity of bees. They are visually diverse, they vary in size, and sometimes we don't really recognize them as bees. But just to scamper through and give you an idea of some of the bees, this is a bumblebee. This is how we imagine bees to be. They are hairy, black and yellow striped, round. It kind of looks like a bee. But in those 3,600 species, there are bees that don't look like bees and are really, really tiny. This is a tiny cuckoo bee. Cuckoo bees don't forage. They actually sneak into the nest of other bees and lay their eggs in those nests and let their bees grow up in another bee's nest. And you can tell from the coin behind, this is a tiny little bee. The smallest bees in the United States are roughly 1/12 of an inch long, and they can be smaller than that. And it's just this little speck that you probably don't recognize as a bee. Some bees are fantastic colors. This is a metallic green sweat bee, amazing emerald-like, with gold sheen and flecks on it. It's just a fantastic and beautiful bee. And bees do come in all sorts of colors. There are blue bees, black bees, red bees, green bees, striped bees. Some are orange striped, some red striped. As you imagine, with such huge diversity, the range of colors and markings is almost as diverse. Some bees look a little more drab. This probably would be recognized as a bee if you saw it. Many bees are not that brightly colored, shades of brown, stripes. But the interesting thing about this one, or what makes this notable, is you look at its back leg, and you see its back leg is covered in it's really hairy. Again, we think of honeybees as the typical bee, and a honeybee carries the pollen as a wet lump stuck in its back leg. But most of our native bees carry the pollen dry, and so they have a really hairy patch somewhere on their body. Frequently on the hind leg. On some species, it's on the underside of their body, but they just have a stiff hair and they carry the pollen dry. And then some bees, frankly, are just really, really weird. This one, you can see it has really hairy legs. This is actually a male bee. Those hairs are not to help it to carry pollen. It's to help it while it mates. So that there are bees out there that you probably don't recognize as bees. You're probably surrounded by bees and you may not even realize that they are bees. I also want to mention that wasps are not bees. I know for some people this is blindingly obvious, but the number of times that I've been contacting and people complain about the wasps wrecking their picnic or their dinner on the deck, bees wrecking their picnic or disturbing the dinner on the deck, and it's almost certainly a wasp because the wasps are in there chasing after the meat. So that's why we should care about pollinators, some of the diversity of pollinators and bees in particular. And now a little bit about the natural history, i.e. what bees need, what kind of resources do they need, where do they nest, where might they forage. The life cycle of a bee is the same as a butterfly. Everybody seems to know the butterfly. We studied in school, and so you have the egg, you have the caterpillar, you have the chrysalis, and you have the adult. And the bee completes that same 4 stages. The adult is the phase that we see. That's the one that flies around and does the foraging and what we think of as a bee. The huge majority of our bees are solitary. When it comes to social bees, you have the honeybees, you have bumblebees, and then almost everything else is solitary. So one female is making her own nest, doing their own foraging, providing the food, laying the egg, and doing all of that on her own. In that time, she makes brood cells. In this particular example, this is a ground nesting bee, and so she excavates brood cells in the soil. And you can see on the right-hand side, there's a cross-section of a brood cell in the dirt, and that little yellow ball at the bottom, that's the beginning of the pollen, the food supply that she's gathering. She takes the pollen and nectar into the brood cell, mixes it to make a moist lump, and then she lays an egg on it. And the egg is that little white sausage on the photo on the bottom, the right-hand photo there. And after a few days, maybe a week, that egg hatches out, and we get the larva, the equivalent of the butterfly's caterpillar. And that larva will just live in the brood cell. It literally is sitting on the food. It eats the food. And in the period of a couple of weeks, it passes through several growth stages. And then it moves on and it pupates. It moves into this dormant form. It completely changes the shape, takes on the shape of an adult, but remains dormant and will remain in the brood cell for the rest of the year. And it will emerge from that brood cell at about the same time of year as its mother was active. And once the mother has completed her nest, for most of the solitary bees, that's the end. She dies, her offspring remain in the nest, and they emerge the following year, and she never has any contact with them. Where this happens, that first example was a ground nesting bee, and around about 70% of our native bee species are ground nesting. So that's something in the region of 2,500 species of bees are ground nesting. And all they need access to dirt. It doesn't have to be a completely bare patch. It can be scrappy grass. There are some species, are mining bees, which are frequently called tickle bees. They nest in lawns, they nest in grassy areas. And what happens is that the bee will dig down, dig a little tunnel, and then make some brood cells off that. And depending on the species, the brood cells may be 4 or 6 inches deep. It may be 8, 10, 12, maybe even 18 inches or 2 feet deep. It's an incredible amount of engineering and excavation that goes into it. And some of these nests are very simple, with just a few brood cells, and some are incredibly complex. Almost all the rest of our native bees, more or less the last 30% of them, they are tunnel nesting, and they typically need an existing tunnel. I mean, natural areas, this might be a beetle bored tunnel in a dead snag. It might be a hollow stem in elderberry or raspberry or something like that. And the bees will take that narrow tunnel and they will divide it up down the length of the tunnel into a series of brood cells. And the two illustrations, the drawings on the right-hand side there, the lower one shows a mason bee. Many people are aware of mason bees now because of their importance in gardens and pollination of orchards and so on. And the mason bee gathers wet soil, builds a wall to divide up that tunnel, puts the food supply in and then the egg, and then builds another wall, and down the length of the tunnel just builds a series of these brood cells. The upper illustration is a leafcutter bee, and similarly the leafcutter bees will be creating a series of isolated cells down the length of that tunnel, but it cuts little pieces of leaf. Very neatly cut, specific shapes and sizes for different parts of the brood cell, and then stitches them together with their jaws and saliva. And obviously, to make nests like that, bees need nest materials. This photograph is a leafcutter bee carrying that beautiful cut piece of leaf back into the nest. This particular species nests in the ground, which is relatively unusual for leafcutters. Other bees need other items, wet mud, little stones, resin from trees. Some of them are mulching up leaf pulp to take in and make the nests, but they still need that as another element of their habitat. Again, bumblebees, another type of bees, are social bees. They need an existing hole. They make a tiny nest. The queen starts the nest, makes a series of brood cells with wax from her that she exudes from her own body, and only needs an area that may be 6 or 8 inches in size, but it needs a small cavity, maybe a rodent hole, a mouse nest. Maybe she can get underneath tumble down grasses. She just really needs these untidy areas. And a bit of chaos wherever you go can be a great benefit to all sorts of wildlife. Overwintering butterflies, ground nesting bees could get into the scrappy areas, bumblebees. A bit of chaos is awesome. And then obviously bees also need flowers. They need somewhere to go forage. They will typically be happy to collect nectar from any flower they can get their tongue into, but some bees can be very particular about the flowers they collect pollen from. And there are specialized bees that only collect pollen from a single species of flower, sometimes just a closely related group of flowers. Threats, again, partly similarly with why we should care about pollinators. I'm not going to linger for long on threats. Some of the threats are visceral and really grab you. Habitat loss, when you see a housing development go in, or you see a forest being cut and cleared. Some of these kind of habitat loss are really obvious, and you can't ignore them. Some habitat loss you barely notice. Anywhere that doesn't have the resources to support the bees, the nest sites, the flowers, that's a loss of habitat. And that can be from putting bark chips down for weed control on an area. It can be from pursuing that image of that immaculate lawn. Pesticides are a major threat, a major concern for pollinators and other insects, because insecticides are designed specifically to harm insects. The photograph on the screen here, these are sample jars. 7 years ago, during Pollinator Week 2013, there was an incident very close to where we are here in Portland, where some trees were treated in a parking lot. And they were treated to control aphids, but the insecticides got all the way through the sap and into the flowers. And approximately 50,000 bumblebees died in that parking lot over a period of 2 to 3 weeks. And these samples were collected because an analysis was done by the Oregon Department of Agriculture, and they were able to prove that it was use of that insecticide that led directly to the death of those bumblebees. Now, the insecticide was applied legally, so that there was no fault by anybody in that death. It underscores the importance of trying to avoid pesticides. The silver lining from this incident was that the Department of Agriculture here in Oregon changed the regulations so that those species of trees, the linden trees, the basswood trees in the genus Tilia, you can no longer apply these insecticides to those trees. And then, of course, we have climate change, which is like the big issue that we're all struggling with. And to some extent, we might think like, wow, what can I do as an individual to deal with climate change? Well, it's the same thing. Climate change, insecticides, we're trying to provide the nest sites and the foraging that bees need. The core comes down to habitat. If we can put habitat in that is has rich in flowers, is clean of pesticides, provides the nest sites that the pollinators need, then we can begin to address so many of these problems. And if we're doing this everywhere, and if we're thinking about the plants, making drought tolerant choices, then we can begin to address this problem of climate change, because we will be making our landscapes more resilient. We will be creating areas that can support bees and other pollinators this year, next year, and into the future. Beekeeping in backyards, there are reasons for keeping honeybees, but bee conservation is not one of them. Keeping honeybees is not conservation. Conservation is making sure there's habitat. Conservation is avoiding the insecticides. Conservation is thinking about the needs of our native bees. If you want an analogy, if you want to save sage grouse or songbirds, you wouldn't keep chickens in your backyard. Chickens are managed livestock, and the non-native European honeybee is similarly managed livestock. And so beekeeping is not bee conservation. Bee conservation means providing the habitat, and we want to provide the habitat that supports the entire life cycle of the pollinators. Secure nest sites where they can be for a year, flowers for foraging, and a pesticide-free environment. One of the great things about bees is that they are small and they can fly. So this means that they don't need large areas of habitat, and they don't necessarily need the nest site and the foraging site in the same area, because they can get around. And this diagram just illustrates that point. Black and white arrows point to where they might forage, black arrows to where they might nest. And so some might be nesting in a tree and foraging on the flowers on the grassland in the middle. Some might be nesting in the bank in the middle, but foraging out in the nearest copse, small woodland where there are flowers. And this illustrates that concept in a neighborhood. The two little dotted lines show how a bee might move around through the neighborhood to find the nest sites, to find the foraging areas, to find all the resources that they require. And as we look in around our neighborhoods, we see these areas, and some areas are not necessarily, we don't necessarily recognize as habitat, but roadsides, parks, high school, or any school playing field, eco roofs, rooftops, these can all contribute to the habitat. Bioswales in parking lots, power line easements. Most power line companies don't like trees, which means there's a big opportunity for open, flowering, sunny, warm habitat. Hanging on to dead trees and snags where we can is really important, and also our own gardens, because we can all contribute to providing the habitat that's needed. When it comes to nest sites, bees need Bare ground where they can nest, they need dead trees and other places where are those hollows, those little narrow tunnels where they can get in and make their brood cells. So wherever you can keep these features in the landscape, do. You don't have to tidy up and grow plants on every bare area. We don't have to cut down and remove every snag because it's considered to be an eyesore. These areas don't need to be big. This photograph shows an area that's only 8 or 10 inches wide between a driveway and the base of a rocky wall. And you can see just under the edge of that rock, there are the holes and the excavated soil from those nests. That wasn't a large area, but it was just enough. It was all that the ground bee needed to get in and make its nest. When we come to the tunnel nesting bees, there's more evidence and it's much easier to provide these nests. Anything with a tunnel hole, and you can drill holes in blocks. You can use hollow stems such as bamboo or common reed if it's around. If you're drilling holes, anything between 3/16 inch diameter and 3/8 inch diameter is a good diameter drill. Make them 4 to 6 inches deep. The larger diameter holes need to be deeper. And the reason for that is, remember, going down the tunnel, the bee makes a series of brood cells. The last 3 or 4 brood cells that the mother bee will make, those will emerge as male bees, and it's only the brood cells at the back of the nest that produce female bees. And so if you've got a short nest, there'll be more male bees and fewer female bees. So make your nest tunnel as deep as you can. And this system really does work. Can't guarantee that you put a nest block up or a bundle of stems, but there's a very good chance that it will be occupied, and you'll see it getting occupied because you'll be able to watch the bees coming and going. You'll see the tunnels being sealed by leaf pieces or dirt or whatever the bee has been using to create its nest. You'll also find other things in these nests. That straggly bit of grass sticking out there, that tells me that that's a solitary wasp called a grass carrier wasp that's occupying that. And there are a lot of wasps that will occupy these nest blocks you put up, but it's not a threat to you. There's no problem from these solitary gentle wasps. They're just looking for a place to nest, and they will be fantastic control of the other insects you may not want in your yard. Bumblebees, they are living in a small cavity, and you can make a box, a wooden box, 8 inches square, 8 inches tall. Put a little bit of soft light bedding in, use a 3/4 inch plastic pipe or a hose pipe as an entrance tunnel. Tuck it away somewhere in an undisturbed corner under a bush. You can bury it if you want. And they do work, but probably only 1 out of every 5 maybe will ever be occupied. So if your grandpa has a workshop and loves making stuff, then yeah, set him to it because there's no harm in trying. But really for bumblebees, you need to, the best way of doing it is to have those untidy areas, to have those places where mice and small rodents can get in and nest, and then you'll be providing the natural kind of habitat that the bumblebees really love. We're coming up to flowers. As I say, like with nest sites, flowers everywhere. Wherever you have flowers, try and keep them. Try not to clear away weeds. Obviously, if it's an invasive species, you're not going to encourage people to keep an invasive species or allow that to spread. Those should be controlled because they are potentially more harmful. But wherever you can, have flowers, create new patches, and locally native plants are better for bees. For the color, bees have fantastic color vision, but they don't really see the color red. They see ultraviolet, so they're shifted. Their spectrum is shifted to the ultraviolet. And so colors, white, yellow, purple, these are great colors for bees. They don't really see red because of the way their eyes work. Red is the same color as green, which, as you can imagine, is very difficult to see a green flower against green foliage. Diversity, when you're thinking about planting, there's this huge range of bees, and they're out at all sorts of different times of the year. And so we encourage people to have a diversity of flowers, a diversity of shapes, a diversity of colors, a diversity of species. Try and have at least 3 different species of plant blooming at any time from late winter when bumblebees are appearing through to late summer and into fall. And that's the bloom period. Bees will be active. It varies from region to region. In some of the southern parts of this country, you will have bees active all year. Where we are in Oregon, our earliest bees appear in mid to late February and will be active through to October, maybe a little later. But the further north you go, it's going to be a shorter period. So really, once spring starts happening, that's when you need to be thinking about, do you have flowering species? Native species of plants have been shown to support a greater diversity and a greater abundance of bees. So we encourage native species. Drought tolerance, often native species are more drought tolerant. But as we're moving into climate change, it becomes more important to be thinking about watering, the ability for flowers to survive in drier, hotter conditions. And the last point on this slide is landscape context. That takes us back to the idea of partial habitats. As I mentioned earlier, my garden is small, and I know that means I can't supply all the flowers and all the nest site opportunities that the bees need. But I know that a block away, there's a creek corridor, and there are willow trees flowering down there, and they flower really early, and they're a key forage for bumblebees and mining bees early in the year. And so I know that forage is already there within flight range from my house. And so I have flowers that bloom a little later in the year that begin to fill the gap so that there's more for the bees. So do look around what you have in your neighborhood and see what's missing. Imagine you're flying around your neighborhood like a bee, wondering what you're going to eat, wondering where you can nest. And when you figure that out, then you can see what's missing and what you can provide. I have a series of flowers here just to illustrate some of the plants. And again, this is Oregon, though many of these plants are nationwide. Early in the year, on the left, you have flowering willows and golden currant. Moving into spring and the early summer, and lupins. And at the bottom there, a plant called hardhack or steeple spire. Later in the summer, plants like pearly everlasting are fantastic. And then late summer, so the classic late summer asters and some of these other sunflower family. And then on the bottom, there's a plant called beggar's tick, which is a wonderful fall bloom and a fantastic plant for migrating monarchs. And then just looping back next to that, thistles. Thistles, I know, are maligned and disliked, but they are a fantastic source of nectar. Native thistles deserve to be given time and space. I'm not talking about Canada thistle, bull thistle, or any of those invasive, but native thistles, like the tall thistle, like the western thistle. Wherever you can, try to have those. There's also a place when we're talking about gardens for what might be referred to garden plants. These are the ones that you can easily find at garden centers. And even with these, there's enough evidence that suggests that the ones that are closer to native to your area are probably better. And so again, this example is for Oregon. The top photo there is a purple coneflower, native to the east of the country, a fantastic plant for gardens everywhere, but it's not native in Oregon, but it supports a good range of pollinators, and it's what might be called considered near native because it's from the same country. The bottom photograph is French lavender, also known as Spanish lavender. This is a European plant, so not at all native, but great source of nectar, supports all sorts of bees, and is one of the, in my garden, is one of the more important plants flowering through April and into May. So garden plants, choose them carefully. There is a place for them in your yard. But some of these garden plants that we see have inadvertently, in the process of hybridizing and creating new varieties, have lost the ability to produce nectar and pollen. We don't have a great grip on this yet. We don't have a list of, these are cultivars and varieties that are good and these are bad. So just very simple guidance when you're going to garden center to buy plants. Look at the plants. Which ones have got bees on them? Which ones do not have bees on them? And pick the ones that have bees on them, because there's a good chance that those are going to support more bees in your garden. Eco lawns in general, it doesn't have to be an eco lawn, it just doesn't have to be manicured. There is a space for white clover and some other clovers and self-heal and bird's foot trefoil, plants that are considered weeds in a lawn, but if allowed to grow, and you can mow them, you can tend them, you can keep them looking like a lawn, but they will bring flowering plants and forage into an area that would otherwise be barren. I'm watching the time and I realize I'm running a little bit long, so I apologize for that. I will scamper through my last few slides because I know we are coming up towards the end. Pesticides are a major issue for pollinators. We could do a whole webinar. In fact, we have done entire webinars on pesticides. So I'm not going to linger for long on these. As was illustrated by the incident in Wilsonville where all those bumblebees died, even when pesticides are applied correctly, legally, according to all the instructions on the label, they can still be harmful to bees and other pollinators. So in essence, don't use pesticides, don't use insecticides. Wherever you can, avoid them. You do need to be aware that when you're buying plants from a garden center, the plants have often been treated. And some of these pesticides, particularly those in the group known as neonicotinoids, will last for a long time. And so plants that have been treated in the nursery, moved to the garden center, and then planted in your yard, can carry that insecticide and carry that problem through. So when you go to a garden center, ask, what has this plant been treated with? And endeavor to try and find garden centers, and there are more and more garden centers, more and more plant suppliers who are not treating their plants with neonicotinoids. And so it is possible to find plants that you might consider to be safe for pollinators. But of course, with all that glorious habitat you're putting in, all those flowers, all that nesting area, all those tumbled down bits of untidiness in your yard, you're also going to be having so much else. You're going to have lady beetles, you're going to have ground beetles, you're going to have wasps, you're going to have those flies that pollinate are also predators of aphids and greenfly. So by creating habitat for pollinators, you will be creating habitat that will support so much else that will help control the pests in your own yard. Just in closing, Bring Back the Pollinators is a campaign that we have for principles of growing pollinator-friendly flowers, providing nest sites and egg laying for butterflies and other pollinators, avoid using pesticides, and share the word. If you can do those 4 things, then you can make the commitment. You can go to our website, you can sign the pledge. To say that you're going to be a friend for pollinators. You want to get beyond the garden gate, you can get your community to do pollinator conservation. Bee City USA, beecityusa.org will give you all the information you need. You can also take part in community science programs such as Bumblebee Watch, or some of the regional bumblebee atlases, or the milkweed monarch mapper in the West. And your garden can become part of a nationwide network, a nationwide movement. So it can become more than simply a beautiful place for you, a great place for your kids, and a wonderful place for pollinators. I know I've scampered through and thrown a lot of information at you. I'm not expecting you to remember everything. We have produced a number of books that will help you sit back and rethink and consider what you can do. All of these are available from wherever you prefer to buy books. On our website, which is xerces.org, you can go there and you can download lots of information, fact sheets that provide plant lists for different regions, guidance on how to create meadows, how to protect pollinators from pesticides, etc., etc. It's all there on our website for you to download and read at your leisure. You can also go to YouTube. This webinar will be on YouTube. If you wanted to rewatch it, you'll find other videos and presentations that we've done. You can follow us on social media on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. And you can pick up more information there, and we'll share new resources. And yeah, we are donor supported. So if you're not a donor and you think you'd like to support us, please do go to our website. You'll find nice, obvious links. And thank you so much for your patience this morning and your time. I'd be very happy to answer any questions from you. I know that we were planning to run for an hour. I will be happy to sit and keep answering questions for longer than that. But if people need to leave after an hour, please do, and please don't feel that you should be embarrassed about that. So thank you very much. Thanks again for being here. Thank you for your patience. And I'll turn it over to Rachel, who can moderate the questions.
Thank you, Matthew. And just a quick note for those of you who will need to leave right at 11, we do have an evaluation that will pop up as soon as you leave the Zoom call, and we appreciate any feedback. That would be great. So your questions, you have quite a few about pesticides and quite a few about ground nesting bees. So I will just kick it off. The first question, which I find quite interesting, how do ground nesting bees defend against ants?
That is a really good question, and it's a little embarrassing to admit, but I'm stumped on the first question. I honestly don't know. I also don't. I haven't. I mean, I spend more time peering at little holes in the ground and sitting around watching stuff on the ground than most people. And I don't actually remember an occasion when I've seen ants going in and out of what I know is a bee nest. I've also never read anything. I don't even know if anybody's done any research on this question. So that's distinctly one for me to look into. And I apologize for not being able to give you a direct answer. I mean, in general, the ground nesting bees, they do, they close their nests off, so there is an element of protection. If the nest is not active, i.e. the female is not working to excavate it or feed it or forage on it, apart from that period, you really would have no idea that there's a nest there. She backfills the tunnel when the nest is complete. Every brood cell is sealed off going down the tunnel. So even while she's still working, unless the brood cell is, she's actively supplying it, which can take several foraging trips, the brood cell is closed and sealed. And at the end of it, the nest is completely refilled. During the time it's open, it is at risk for sure. And there are bees, there are cuckoo bees that are waiting around to creep in and lay their eggs in those nests that are being built. And there are also some flies, the bee flies, that will drop their eggs near nests, and from their perspective, hopefully get a clear shot so it drops all the way into the nest. But to protect from ants, I apologize, I don't know.
All right. I think you answered it well, to the best of your ability. How far generally do native bees travel when foraging?
Yeah, sorry, I should have mentioned that earlier. The distance a bee can travel is very much related to its size. And so for the small bees, it's not very far at all. It's for some of those tiny bees, and again, there's with so many bees, they haven't necessarily been, it's difficult to measure how far, but people have figured out that you can make some measurements on a bee's body and estimate the flight range. And so the smallest bees may only fly 100 or 200 feet. So that's not very far at all. The larger bees, like mason bees, will fly a couple of 100 yards maybe. The bigger the bee, as I said, the further it can fly. Bumblebees are really big. When you're an inch and a quarter long, you're a really big bee. And so bumblebees will fly half a mile or a mile easily enough. And there have been known to fly much further than that. Sometimes when there's not many flowers, they will have to travel further. But no, in terms of the smaller bees, most of the solitary nesting bees, they don't fly very far. That's one reason why it's important to try and provide the habitat in a relatively small area. But it's also one reason why pollinator conservation is so great for neighborhoods and gardens, because the bees are flying from one garden to another. And it's not like, often when we think about wildlife conservation, we think of corridors and the need for there to be a solid corridor, constantly connected areas of habitat, such as a river, or on a very small scale, a hedgerow or even a roadside. But because the bees can fly, they can get from one yard to another. They can fly across a road. They can, if like in my neighborhood, and just to mention this photo on the screen, this is my own garden. I may as well be honest and say, hey, I actually can do some of these things I've been talking about. But my neighbors, their gardens don't have flowers. So for the bees to get to my garden, they have to fly over a couple of rather barren lots before they get to more flowers. But it's because the bees can fly, and it's great because they may not fly far, but they can get from one garden to another to really make use of your yard.
All right, this next question is just a clarification. I've seen a few questions about specifically, what do you mean by avoid double flowered varieties?
Oh, sure. Yeah, sorry. Double flowered, and what that means is that in the process of creating these hybrid varieties, the plant breeders have created flowers with more and more petals. And that photograph that I had, that is that was a marigold. But naturally, marigolds are much more open flowers. But in the process of breeding, to make them attractive to people, they've created more petals. And there's now, in the process of making petals, those plants have actually lost the pollen producing parts of their flower structure. I mean, if you look at, another example is if you look at a wild rose, it's a very flat, open flower with, just a handful of petals on it, and the center of it is that it's got hundreds of the anthers in the middle. But if you look at a cultivated rose, there's incredibly ornate, many dozens of petals, and that's another example of those cultivated roses. Ornamental roses are what might be considered a double flowered version.
All right, a few questions about specifically bees and whether they need soil that is in shady areas for nesting, or do they need full sun sites?
It varies very much on the species. I think on the whole, they probably go for sunny sites, but there are some species that will happily nest in shady areas. One of the problems with there being so many different species, it's very difficult to talk in general terms about, they need a certain type of soil, or they need a certain depth of soil, or a particular slope angle. Because when there are so many different species, there are some bees that will nest in soil that is almost pure sand, and some bees that will nest in sandstone and actually collect water to soften the stone so that they can dig it out. And it's most types of soil in between. On the whole, ground nesting bees go for sandier or loamier soils. I guess those are easy to dig. I mean, I know from my experience that if you have a heavy clay soil, it can be really hard to dig sometimes. But if you have a sandier soil, it's much easier. But there are some bees that will nest in clay soils. And so it's very difficult to provide specific conditions to suit the bees. The best thing is just to try and keep the soil that you've got, because some bees will occupy it. And on the whole, they go for sunny areas.
All right, this is a good question. How does Xerces feel about ordering mason bees online to put in your yard?
We would prefer if people are creating their own habitat to support the bees that are already there. There have been some incidences where you know, mason bees have been shipped from, you know, one state to another. They have taken diseases with them. There's also there's a non-native mason bee called a horn-faced bee that arrived from Japan, I believe it was, and was initially only known in the area around, you know, near Washington, D.C., actually in Maryland, I believe is where they were initially introduced. But those bees are now found all the way over on the West Coast, and the reason they traveled is because they were packed in with the native mason bees that were shipped from one place to another. So, I mean, our preference is for people to create the habitat and support the bees that are already there.
All right. There's a lot of really good questions. I'm having a hard time sifting through them. I commend the attendees. Quite a few people have asked about our habitat sign, to order it, if they can make their own, and if it's a possibility to place them in parks where people are purposefully maybe destroying nest sites.
Sure.
Out of fear.
Yeah, I mean, our habitat signs, we don't directly sell them now. They're only available via the gift center on our website, so that you make a donation and we give you a sign. Where you put them is entirely up to you. You can put them anywhere you like. If you're going to put them in a park or some other public place, you probably should get the permission from the park district and the park managers. I personally, I see our signs all over the place in public places, in private gardens. You can also make your own. I mean, we have our sign available, but you can make any sign, and I've seen examples of beautiful homemade signs that kids have made or artists have painted. I don't care what kind of sign goes up. I love it if people put a sign up that says this is pollinator habitat, because it raises awareness. It encourages other people to do more. And it also, for some people, it explains why your yard isn't mown grass and why your yard may not look as manicured as some others around. And for some people where they have homeowners associations with pretty strict rules, that in itself can be a useful thing. And yeah, if you want to have one of our signs, great. But if you'd like to make your own, go for it.
So a question we get often, and one that's come up a few times here, is it necessary to clean out the bee hotels?
Yeah, the nesting blocks, in fact, there's a pretty active debate going on now as to whether they are good or not. Cleaning out and maintaining hygiene in these nest sites is a valuable thing to do. The reason for that is that once a bee has occupied it, it's going to be dirty. There may be parasites in there. There may be diseases and fungus. And if you put a block up and don't do anything to it, after maybe 3 years, it's going to have no particular value for bees any longer. It just won't have any clean holes. You can clean out the tunnels each year, and to do that, you need to have your tunnels lined with a paper straw. You can pull the straw out, then you can clean the block with a mild bleach solution. You can also, with mason bees, where the bees are in cocoons, or leafcutter bees where they're in the little leaf cells, you can also clean and inspect and check those cells. But in my experience, in general, people sometimes they're all keen and enthusiastic. They're like, yeah, I can do that. But after a year or two, their enthusiasm, their interest wanes, and so the block goes up and it just becomes a sink. So the thing to do is to, if you have a block that you've drilled, after 2 or 3 years, either take the block down and just re-drill it to clean out and remove all the abandoned brood cells and everything else down there, and then clean it with a mild bleach solution, let it dry and sanitize, and then put it back out. Or if you don't want to do that, just take that block, chuck it make a new one and put a fresh one up. In fact, you could put a fresh block up every year and just have a cycle of over 2 or 3 years of clean blocks and then old blocks that you're disposing of.
All right, this is a lawn question. These folks have neglected their lawn, but they mow not, every week, but maybe every other week, but they're concerned about mowing over bees. How would they deal with that situation?
So there's two things. One, if you're mowing and the bees are foraging on the flowers, you may be concerned about mowing the bees as well. On the whole, as you walk forward, bees will see you coming. You'll disturb them, and they will clear out. If you're really concerned, you could potentially do it. Have 2 people. This is how the very early days of the motor car, they would have one person walking in front, warning you that the motor car was coming. You could do that with your lawnmower if you wanted. Have someone walking in front, and that would disturb anything that's on the flowers. The alternative is some people are concerned that they have ground nesting bees, and they're concerned that mowing over the ground nests might be problematic, and it's not at all. The ground nesting bees, they will, in the evening, they'll not be active. They'll be tucked away in their nest overnight. And so if you have a significant ground nesting aggregation, and when I say significant, sometimes these bees can nest 10, 20, 40,000 bees in one fairly small area. You can just mow those, go out in an evening and just mow straight over the top. And then the bees will come out the next day without any harm.
Great. We have a few questions specifically about pesticides and how to buy pesticide-free plants. The nursery industry is somewhat a fan of pesticides. Wash pesticides off commercially grown ones before planting. How long will pesticides remain in the plant year? I know this is a very loaded question.
It is. With a lot of the pesticides these days, they are systemic, which means that they are inside the plant. So it's because they're systemic that they have become such a problem, because they turn up in the nectar and in the pollen because they're inside the plant. With those, it can be very difficult, and you can't just rinse down a plant because there's nothing on the outside to wash away. It is possible to, when you have a plant, to drench the root area with water and keep the roots really wet for a week or 2 weeks. And then because there's so much moisture, there's a chance that will kind of flush some of the pesticides out from inside the plant. You can also, if you want, you can literally snip the flowers off a plant in its first year of growth. If you've got a shrub or a perennial, you know that it's going to grow back the following year. And so if in its first year, if you snip the flowers off, then that's another way that I know some people have tried to protect bees from getting the insecticides. The other thing is to go back and look at the source of the plants, find out where you're buying them. Big box stores, chain nurseries, those bring in flowers from many different suppliers. And although some of these big box stores, including Home Depot and Lowe's, have made a commitment in recent years to sell plants that certainly do not have neonicotinoids in them, it's been very hard to find out whether they've actually followed through on that. And even if you go and question the staff at those garden centers, they don't always know what the plant's being treated with. So that brings us back around to working with local plant providers. There are small local nurseries, some of whom are growing their own plants. And with those people, you have a direct contact with the grower, and you can ask them and find out what they've been treated with. You can also, most years there are a huge number of native plant sales organized by nonprofits and nature parks and city park departments. And those can be great places to pick up beautiful native plants, and you can work directly with the grower at many of those places. And those are the growers, these smaller growers, who are working hard to grow plants in ways that are either organic or use minimal pesticides. So trying to find neonicotinoid-free plants can be a little hard and can be take a little bit of effort, but it is possible. And I would add that we, Xerces, our pesticide team have actually just recently been working on developing guidance on this precise issue, on how you can work with nurseries and garden centers, and what questions to ask and what information to try and gather. We don't have that available yet, but we expect to have it available in the next couple of months.
Great. I love this next question. This woman lives in a retirement community, and there are some individuals who wanted to put in a pollinator pathway. There are a few people in other properties that are quite hysterical about the possibility of any bee being anywhere in her universe. I'm sorry, I have to laugh and chuckle a little bit about that. But there are a lot of people that are very afraid of bees. So do you have any suggestions on how to soothe her? And I think this is something we run into a lot.
Yeah, no, this is a concern. For some people, unfortunately, I don't think there is anything that we can say or do that will pacify them. When I'm talking to people, I explain about the chances of being stung, and again, this idea of being stung takes us back to this. Our primary image of the honeybee. We think of the honeybee, people think of being stung and the fact that the stinger is left in and you have to drag it out. They also mix bees and wasps in their minds. The honest reality, our native bees are incredibly gentle. They're very unlikely to sting. Some of them physically can't sting. Mining bees in the genus Andrena, their stinger is so weak it can't penetrate most human skin. But I only know of one person who will admit to having been stung by a mining bee, and he's a bee scientist, and he was telling me about apparently his mining bees have these scent glands near their mouth, and he took this bee in his fingers and he held it up to his nose so he could smell the scent glands. And the tip of his nose is one of the thinnest bits of skin on the human body. And he got stung on the tip of his nose. So the moral of that, obviously, is don't pick up a bee and smell it. But the rest of our bees, because they're solitary, they don't have a nest to defend. And so they are going to fly away from you. They're not going to try and fight you or chase you away. Honeybees, because they have a very large colony, they don't mind, as a colony, losing a number of individuals protecting that colony, protecting their honeycomb. And so they are more likely to sting and defend their nest. Solitary bees are not going to do that. They're going to fly away. And so the most of the bees that you encounter are going to be very gentle. They're going to be reluctant to sting and reluctant to confront you.
This is an interesting question. A woman who lives in Seattle said that many of the parks have had less maintenance this spring due to the pandemic. Is anyone studying urban insect response to these changes, especially with people doing a lot more gardening, with the increase of possible flower, maybe more yard maintenance and maybe more chemical use? But are there any hypotheses about how this spring or summer might be different for urban pollinators and other insects? Sounds like an interesting study.
Yeah, no, and I was thinking like, wow, what great questions are coming up today. I'm not aware of any studies specifically that have been looking into the impact of maintenance this spring compared to maintenance in previous springs. And that would be a difficult one to do because we don't have the baseline information. So it's not like, last year, someone went out to these gardens, did all the observations and measurements, and now people are doing the work, and there'll be more observation and measurements. So that would be a difficult one to ever have definitive answers on. There is one study I'm aware of in Wisconsin, the city of Appleton, which is a Bee City USA affiliate, as it happens. They pushed to have a no mow May, where they gave a temporary lift of the city's ordinance on mowing to allow homeowners to let their lawns grow, and with that, the dandelions and clover and everything else in the lawn. Because that was planned, there is a researcher from the university there, which has been doing exactly this, and he has found that compared to previous years and compared to plots, gardens that are continuing to be mowed, those yards that allowed their grass to grow longer do have more bees and more diversity of bees in them. So we do have some evidence even from this year of direct benefit from allowing your yard to be less tidy and to allow your lawn to grow. I also know that there's a research project actually in Portland, Oregon, where some researchers from Oregon State University have been looking at the bees in gardens for a couple of years. And so there's one where we do have baseline data, and it's entirely possible that they may be able to see whether there was a change in bee populations following on from the extra work that was done this year.
Okay, great. There's a few questions specifically about social media, Pollinator Week, and how people can, both with their Master Naturalist group and in their own Facebook groups or social media, how to talk to people about Pollinator Week, if we have any resources for that. I know that we'll be posting our own that people can definitely share, but I didn't know if you have anything to add to that.
No, it's a great, like I said, it's really great questions. In terms of talking about pollinators, I find, and I say I've been doing this for 20 years, but I still find that some of the most impactful information that we push out is about the diversity of pollinators and the diversity of bees. It's these very simple nuggets of information that seem to resonate with people. For people who had thought that bees meant bumblebees and honeybees, to discover that there are thousands of species and maybe hundreds in their local town is kind of mind-blowing. And to discover that bees can be green and hairy or not hairy, those simple things are the ones that seem to have the biggest impact and really engage people. So if you're wanting to do information on your local, whether it's personal Facebook, social media, or a local group social media, just find simple facts, simple bits of information like that, and push that information out. Do direct people to resources, and I mean, I would offer Xerces resources for anybody who wants to use them. Link to, the fact sheets on our website, the plant list for your region. Link to the Bring Back the Pollinators page, which lays out those 4 principles and provides an entryway to more and more information. And yeah, there's also, for us, we have the resources, so we're going to be putting out new blogs each day next week about some of the work we're doing, and some just about pollinators, because it's Pollinator Week, but it's not all bees. Today we had a blog about moth pollination and the fact that pollinators work at night. Next week we have a blog about beetles, which again is just a general information, just trying to extend awareness of pollinators beyond purely bees. And of course, another thing, social media, it is interactive, so that does mean that you have to spend time answering questions and responding to comments. So I hope that was helpful.
Yes, definitely. Thank you, Matthew. Well, I'm going to go ahead and end it there at time. Thank you so much, Matthew, for your time today. And we hope you all have a wonderful rest of your day.
Yeah, thank you so much, everybody. Appreciate your time.